3 verses 3 and 4. Isaiah 53 verses 3 and 4. Isaiah writes, "He is despised and rejected of men, a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief. And we hid, as it were, our faces from him. He was despised, and we esteemed him not. Surely he hath borne our griefs and carried our sorrows. Yet we did not esteem him, stricken, smitten of God, and afflicted." Of course, this refers to Christ. But you notice that he was a man that was acquainted with griefs. Indeed, this life is full of grief, is it not? There was a popular song that was, well, I became acquainted of it through the singer Roger Whittaker, that began, "The moment you are born, you begin to die." I think it was entitled "The Last Farewell." Well, in the first week of January this year, I believe it was on January 1st to be precise, a house fire claimed the life of a local man over there in Casey. Just last week, Dad informed me that one of our local men, our acquaintances, had passed away. He was in his 80s, but it came as a kind of a shock because we didn't know he was, or at least I didn't know he was that bad off. And in my online Bible reading group, one of our members succumbed to infection and diabetes and passed from this life. We often hear of weather events such as tornadoes, hurricanes, etc., the earthquakes, fires, as well as accidents, age, and health being the cause of the death of individuals. And this is just one type of grief that we have in life. There are many other types of grief. Heartaches due to individuals leaving us, not in the permanent sense that we were just talking about as in death, but the loss of friendships, loss of children or family members who have held a grudge or who have decided to cut all ties with us for some reason known only between us and them. Grief because of bullying, which has become quite rampant in our schools this day. You see, Jesus was acquainted with griefs. He was rejected. He was despised. He was accounted as smitten of God. He was mocked, spat upon, accused of being from the devil, accused of being a wine bibber, a drunkard. Jesus was acquainted with griefs. In fact, he went to the cross for you and I. Along with the events that we've been mentioning, James chapter 4 and verse 14 reminds us that our life is short. We all have lessons that we have heard from various preachers and teachers stand out in our mind down through the ages, and this is I'm no different. Many years ago, I can say that now, Dad had preached this type of a lesson, basing it off of James chapter 4 and verse 14. And he used an object in regards to this. It was an aerosol can. You remember it, Jeremy? It was up at Perry. I think he's even preached it here. There was other ones he used as well, because I remember the shoe one as well. The work boots. But he used the aerosol can and he spritzed it in the air. Your life is just like that vapor that just came, that mist that just came from the aerosol can. Life is short. James 4:14 tells us, whereas you know not what shall be on the morrow. For what is your life? It is even a vapor that appeareth for a little time and then vanisheth away. What can we do as Christians come grief? Each one of us is going to have times of grief. Life, death is inevitable. Turn with me to the book of 1 Samuel, chapter 1. One of the first things that we can do, and this is not an exhaustive list of things that we can do to overcome grief. But I hope to give some pointers from the scriptures themselves. 1 Samuel chapter 1. Here we are introduced to a man named Elkanah. He has two wives, Peninnah and Hannah. Now, Peninnah has been able to bear children. Hannah, on the other hand, has not. And it became such a point of contention between Peninnah and Hannah that Hannah resorted to this tip. That is, in her bitterness, verse 10, she prayed unto the Lord and wept sore. When we are dealing with grief, no matter the cause, whether it be bullying, as Hannah was suffering, it be loss of a friend, loss of a loved one, no matter the grief, no matter the bitterness of your soul, resort to praying to the Lord. It sounds so cliche, but indeed, who is the one that is acquainted with griefs? Who is the one that knows your heart the best? But God. Listen to the vow that she made in the bitterness of her heart, in her grief. She vowed a vow and said, O Lord of hosts, if thou wilt indeed look on the affliction of thy handmaid, and remember me, and not forget thine handmaid, but wilt give unto thine handmaid a man-child, then I will give him unto the Lord all the days of his life, and there shall no razor come upon his head. Now, as she continued praying before the Lord, Eli marked her mouth. Now, Hannah, she spake in her heart, only her lips moved, but her voice was not heard. Therefore Eli thought she had been drunken. And Eli said unto her, How long wilt thou be drunken? Put away thy wine from thee. And Hannah answered and said, No, my Lord, I am a woman of a sorrowful spirit. I have drunk neither wine. See if I can get this. Nor strong drink, but have poured out my soul before the Lord. Count not thine handmaid for a daughter of Belial, for out of the abundance of my complaint and grief have I spoken hitherto. Hannah was so distraught in her grief that she cried unto the Lord. Who do you turn for in your grief? The Lord. In prayer. Of course, she went home with Eli's blessing. And we know the story, how that in the fullness of time, God granted her a son. And she came and gave him, at the time when he was to be weaned, she gave him to the Lord. She brought him to Shiloh, where Eli was, and she gave him up in fulfillment of her vow. But notice in chapter 2 what she did when her grief had passed. As we read 1 through 9, she offers up a song, a praise, a prayer of praise to the Lord. Hannah prayed and said, "My heart rejoiceth in the Lord. Mine horn is exalted in the Lord. My mouth is enlarged over mine enemies, because I rejoiced in thy salvation. There is none holy as the Lord, for there is none beside thee, neither is there any rock like our God." And you can continue to read that prayer of rejoicing and thanksgiving through verse 9. When we are in the midst of grief, pray to God for relief, like Hannah did. And when our grief is past, make sure to remember who it is that saw us through that grief, like Hannah did. Another one who was acquainted with grief on a level that you and I may never know is found in the book of Job. And we're kind of familiar with the book of Job. The man, Job, was a great man. He had lots of possessions. He had 7 sons and 3 daughters. These were grown sons and daughters because they kept going from one house to the other for their partying, for their feasting, as we find in Job chapter 1. However, there came a time of testing brought on by Satan. And as this testing happened, not only did Job lose all of his possessions, but notice with me in verse 22, or rather, let me back up just a moment. Verse 18. Job 1, chapter 18. While he was yet speaking, there came also another and said, "Thy sons and thy daughters were eating and drinking wine in their eldest brother's house. And behold, there came a great wind from the wilderness and smote the 4 corners of the house, and it fell upon the young men, and they are dead. And I only am escaped alone to tell thee." Then Job arose and rent his mantle and shaved his head and fell down upon the ground and worshipped and said, "Naked came I out of my mother's womb, and naked shall I return thither. The Lord gave, the Lord hath taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. In all this Job sinned not, nor charged God foolishly." When we are in the midst of our grief, especially over a loved one or over some health issue that has approached us, that has been given to us, don't charge God foolishly. He lost his 7 sons and 3 daughters in one fell swoop. And what was his response? He did not curse God. He blessed God. He didn't go outside and lift his fists up to the air and say, "Why, God, if there is a God?" He said, "Blessed be God." In our grief, Do not let your emotion overcome your sense. Do not charge God foolishly. Do not curse God. Move over to turn the page to chapter 2. We're going to look at verses 9 and 10. For you see, that wasn't the end of his trial, his grief. Even though he had not sinned at the loss of his possessions and his children, Satan was bound to get him to curse God. And in verse 9, or as we find in the first 8 verses of the chapter, Satan has been given permission to harm Job's body, but not to take his life. Verse 9 finds him sitting in the ash heap, scraping the boils. As it comes to him and says, do you still retain your integrity? Curse God and die. But he said unto her, thou speakest as one of the foolish women speakest. What? Shall we receive good at the hand of God, and shall we not receive evil? In all this did not Job sin with his lips. Job did not curse God. He recognized that this was not something that came from God. Yes, God had allowed it to happen, but did God send it to him? There's a meme that floats around YouTube, or Facebook rather, that really irritates me every time I see it. And it says this: if God brings you to it, he'll bring you through it. Are you sitting there telling me that God is going to give you, or God sends you evil? You telling me that God has sent you an addiction, put you in the middle of an addiction? You mean to tell me that God has put you in the situation that makes you sin, or has put you in this sin? Turn with me to James chapter 1 and verse 13. James chapter 1 and verse 13. Let no man say, when he is tempted, I am tempted of God. For God cannot be tempted with evil, neither tempteth he any man. God didn't put you in the middle of sin. And to charge God so is to charge him foolishly. And this is something that Job never did. But the point that he was making is if I'm going to receive good, then why would I let evil cause me to sin? In our grief, do not curse God. Do not charge him. Do not blame him for our circumstances. In our grief, realize, especially at the loss of a loved one, realize that we cannot bring them back. No matter how much praying, no matter how much fasting, no matter how much we try, we cannot bring them back. 2 Samuel chapter 12, verses 15 through 23. 2 Samuel chapter 12, verses 15 through 23. Here we have David. We have a child that was born of fornication, one that was born unto David and Bathsheba. And God has told David that this is not acceptable. And as we read in verses 15 through, or rather in verse 14, I want to just hit this one real quick. What Nathan tells David is that the child is going to die. Because of the shame and the reproach that David had brought upon God, the child was going to die. And Nathan departed unto his house, and the Lord struck the child that Uriah's wife bare unto David, and it was very sick. David therefore besought God for the child, and David fasted and went in and lay all night upon the earth. And the elders of his house arose and went to him and to raise him up from the earth, but neither did he eat bread with them. And it came to pass on the seventh day that the child died, and the servants of David feared to tell him that the child was dead. For they said, Behold, while the child was yet alive, we spake unto him, and he would not hearken unto our voice. How will he then vex himself if we tell him that the child is dead? But when David saw that his servants whispered, David perceived that the child was dead. Therefore David said unto his servants, Is the child dead? And they said, He is dead. Then David arose from the earth and washed and anointed himself and changed his apparel and came into the house of the Lord and worshiped. And then he came to his own house. And when he required, they set bread before him, and he did eat. Then said his servants unto him, What thing is this thou hast done? Thou didst fast and weep for the child while it was alive. But when the child was dead, thou didst rise and eat bread. And he said, While the child was yet alive, I fasted and wept. For I said, Who can tell whether God will be gracious to me and the child may live? But now he is dead, wherefore should I fast? Can I bring him back again? I shall go to him, but he shall not return to me. David realized this important truth. We cannot bring the dead back, no matter how much we pray, no matter how much we fast. We can't. We can only live our life in such a way as to go to them. That is, provided that they lived a godly life. John chapter 14. John chapter 14. We're going to read 1 through 4. John 14, verses 1 through 4. Notice what Jesus says. Let not your heart be troubled. You believe in God, believe also in me. In my Father's house are many mansions. If it were not so, I would have told you. I go to prepare a place for you. And if I go and prepare a place for you, I will come again and receive you unto myself, that where I am, there ye may be also. And whither I go, ye know the way. Ye know, and the way ye know. Jesus says, I'm going to go and prepare a room for you. There's room enough in my Father's house for you. Our goal on this earth is to make it to heaven. In our grief, we can't bring our loved one back from the dead. But we can take comfort in knowing that we can go to God. And if our loved one has been such as has lived a life of godliness, or one that has died in innocency, we can, like David, be assured that we can go to him or them if we also live our life in godliness according to God's standards. Life is full of grief. Yes, I had 3 more points to make, but I'm already at the time limit, so you're going to have to come back next month, to get the rest of the lesson. Life is full of grief. You know, Jacob told Pharaoh in Genesis chapter 47, verses 8 and 9. I always love this because Jacob comes into the presence of Pharaoh. Pharaoh takes one look at him and goes, "How old are you?" How old are you? Jacob says to Pharaoh, "The days of the years of my pilgrimage are 130 years. Few and evil have been the years of my have the days of the years of my life been, and have not attained unto the days of the years of the life of my fathers in the days of their pilgrimage." Jacob says, few and evil, or sorrowful, unkind, distressing, etc. Few and sorrowful have been the years of my life. Life is full of grief. Grief covers many forms, from bullying to loss of life. But how we deal with our grief is just as important as how we deal with joy, love, goodness from the Lord, etc. Remember Job. Shall we receive good at the hands of the Lord and not evil? Jesus was well acquainted with our griefs. He's well acquainted with griefs, period. He lost friends. He lost disciples. He was mocked, spat upon, rejected, yet he still went to the cross for you and I, out of love. Our life may indeed be short, like that vapor that comes from that air freshener can. But our life, just like that vapor, can be one that is full of a pleasing odor to God. Romans chapter 12, verses 1 and 2. Is your life a pleasing odor to God? Are you dealing with grief? Pray to the Lord. Remember not curse him or charge him foolishly. And remember that while we cannot bring a loved one back, we can go to those who have fallen asleep in the Lord if we live according to the Lord. If we can help you in any way, won't you come as together we stand and as we sing?